We are now starting the Marx lecture, and this is part one. Here we're going to discuss Marx in relation to Aristotle, Kant, Mill, and Sartre by way of a review of what we have done up to now. We're going to introduce the notions of labor, central notion to Marx, history, technology, justice central to Marx, autonomy of labor, struggle of economic classes, and property relations, more notions that are central to Marx. Marx was a philosopher and a social theorist of a very broad scope. He made marks in various disciplines in numerous ways. He studied as a political scientist, economist, sociologist, philosopher, historian, moralist, etc., and from various angles in all those disciplines. Our own engagement of Marx will focus on him in the context of our question: what is a human being? Let us remind ourselves about Mill, Kant, and Sartre, and Aristotle to discuss Marx in continuity with those thinkers. Aristotle proposes that human being is active and an action taker by nature, and so human happiness consists in performing actions well, and even more so in the human soul at work, according to its nature as the soul of an action performer. He then describes what virtue in the soul must be like for successful function of this active being. Mill proposes that human being is a pleasure happiness seeker like the rest of living nature. He then works out how maximal pleasure happiness is best achieved. Kant proposes that human being is a rational being. He then argues that rational choice in each human being must be treated as an end in itself. That way, rational beings can live and are treated as rational beings. Sartre proposes that human being is self-conscious. Anything that enters consciousness is understood to be possible other than it is, or contingent. Human beings understands that it and its values could have been other than they happen to be. What a particular human being is, and what they value, is nothing but a product of choices they made in the past, and they could have made them differently. To be an authentic human being for Sartre, one must choose responsibly, with anguish, abandonment, and despair. Sartre wrote after Marx, in the wake of Marx, and under Marx's influence. Sartre highlights the importance of the past in the constitution of what we are. For Marx, however, the past is not simply each person's past that consists of each person's contingent choices. For Marx, unlike Sartre, the past that makes us what and who we are is history. History operates at the level of human species rather than individuals, and according to history's necessary laws of development. For Sartre, as for Kant, the key to human being is that a human being chooses what they do. For this reason, Sartre and Kant emphasize individual freedom. Even Mill discussed the significance of individual liberties as his way of addressing individual freedom. For Kant and for Sartre, freedom of human beings is an end in itself. For Mill, freedom for human beings is a means to the end of happiness. For Marx, however, The core of a human being is not that they freely choose or that they pursue happiness, but that a human being labors. Labor is the central concept for Marx's understanding of human being. Marx views the necessary laws of development of history and persons as a product of the history and development of labor. Labor, again, is central. For Marx, history just is nothing but the development of ways in which we labor. And those ways determine how we shape our institutions and our values. We can understand Marx's emphasis on labor. In order to live, human beings must labor. The basics, such as food, shelter, and fiber, are obtained by us by laboring. And the same goes for conveniences and luxuries. The key to labor, Marx thinks, is productivity or efficiency. Marx thinks that, ultimately, all of our activities are determined by how we organize labor, and labor is organized for greatest efficiency, greatest output per unit of input. So, labor is always organized for greatest productivity or efficiency, at least eventually. And hence, we have history of labor's development. That much is reasonably uncontroversial. But here is the controversial point. Labor is not organized for the sake of happiness or freedom. Marx treats labor as autonomous, as developing according to laws of its own, for the sake of productivity. Marx takes it that the degrees and qualities of happiness and freedom at any moment in history are determined by what can be afforded by labor organized for greatest efficiency. In other words, labor is autonomous and it develops according to its own laws. And that is the essence of all of development of history, of political institutions, social institutions, how persons conceive of themselves. All of that changes historically as labor develops historically. That's the autonomy of labor thesis. But does this autonomy of labor not seem strange? Do we not want to say that Marx has it backward? Do we not want to say that we organize labor to maximize freedom and happiness, not the other way around? Marx claims that his theory explains much more about what we observe in history, that our institutions, that Marx claims that his theory explains much more about what we observe in history than our intuitions about primacy of happiness and freedom that oppose his theory. How can we make sense of Marx's position on the autonomy of labor? We have to bring in the accompanying principle by which history is explained. Marx claims that history is and is explained by the struggle of economic labor-related classes. Let us bring this thought together with the thesis that labor is autonomous. Whoever is going to be most efficient and productive is going to be the most powerful and establish their way of life and production over the way of life and production of the opponents. In other words, that it seems that autonomy of labor in determining the course of history is determined by an even more fundamental force, struggle for power. Additionally, we may quickly point out that efficiency and productivity of labor is largely dependent upon technology. After all, it is not the difference in people's intellect and physique that explains the differences in their productivity across history, but the difference in their technology. History or development of technology is also history of labor and everything else. Thus, history of labor is really history of development of technology by means of which we labor. And that is what we mean by history as history of labor. If you think about it, today we live in a fundamentally different way than we did 500 years ago. Wolves or other animals live in pretty much the same way as they did 500 years ago. Why is it that we live in a fundamentally different way? Because we labor differently. And that is because we have different technology. And so the whole course of history, according to Marx, is just development of technology in order to make labor more efficient and more productive. And those who are more efficient and more productive are competing everyone else out of existence. Marx takes it that all of life, our work, leisure, government, culture, ideas, religion, gender, sexuality, etc., are as they are because that is what promotes the greatest efficiency in the current mode of production. In other words, ideas such as freedom, happiness, democracy, fascism, equality, inequality, human rights, constitution, republic, corporation, free market, command economy, all of these are neither true nor false in themselves. We do not embrace or condemn these ideas because they are true or false, but based on whether they do or do not promote the greatest efficiency of labor. Everything outside of labor is a support structure for labor. And the key mediator between these two spheres is property relations. What are these property relations? That's where we're going next.